What time do you usually wrap up then if you're kind of starting at 8 in the morning?
Oh God, 7, 8. Sometimes I have dinner and then I go back into the studio. So yeah, it just depends on the deadlines we have. I generally, we work a lot, to keep up. I think that's the price we pay for having such an awesome job is just, to keep the jobs going. You have crazy deadlines, and what happens in post too that doesn't get talked about a lot is our schedules change very dramatically. So you'll agree to do a gig and they'll say, okay, you're going to be done in January. And you say, okay, great. I'm going to schedule everything so I'm done in January. Oh, I have a new film started in February. Perfect. Easy. And then the film that you're supposed to be done on in January goes another 6 months because they decided they want to re-edit or do some additional photography or need more time for visual effects or something. So we inevitably have things get overlapped, which is not ideal, but it's a bit of the reality of how we have to work in post, unfortunately.
Does that mean you have to let projects go sometimes?
You try not to do that. This is why, as composers, I try to operate like an auteur, where I'm really creating all the compositional material and really kind of with fine brush points and doing amazing, trying to keep the bar super high. But there are times where you have to have your team help out, especially on stuff like TV and but that most of the time the team is just conforming, arranging, printing cues, but sometimes additional music is necessary, and that's just the reality of what we do. That's how I got my start, is helping out other composers. It's a great training ground.
You began as a trombonist, right? Playing in orchestras growing up.
Yes. Yes, I did. You did some research. That's fantastic.
Well, I'm intrigued because I used to play in orchestras too, and when you do that, there's a lot of time where you're not playing and you're just sitting there and you're listening. And I'm intrigued by, what did you learn from those moments where you're not playing and you just have to listen? What did you get from that? What did it teach you?
Well, I once had a professor who, looking through my work, and this is when I must have been about 20 years old, said, "Oh, your orchestral writing is very mature. Like, how would you explain that?" And I said, "Well, I sit in orchestras all the time, and oftentimes I'd sit there with the scores. So you're exactly right. As a trombonist, I remember doing Beethoven 5 once, and if you know Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the trombones just sit there for about 40 minutes before they come in. And so what a great opportunity for me to just grab the score, look at how, you follow the cello lines. There were times where I'd just look at one instrument and just follow that instrument along and just kind of, see how Beethoven is writing for the cello, and just, okay, that's how Beethoven likes to write for cello. And, I feel so lucky that I had that experience. I mean, I've played, I don't get to talk about this a lot, but I used to play in the New York Youth Symphony. So I've played Carnegie Hall. I've played all sorts of really cool places all over the New York City and New Jersey area. I'm playing everything from Stravinsky to Bartók to Beethoven to John Corigliano and Broadway music. So I think that is one thing that explains why I'm so voracious in terms of appetite and the projects that I get to work on, that I try to work on. I try to work on really interesting projects, but style is kind of a secondary thought. That's why, I get to work on Straight Outta Compton and then Greatest Showman and then Shadow and Bone and then, Escape from Spiderhead. I get to work on projects that are really different just because my background is so rich and varied.
When you mentioned your professor at the start of that too, and how he spoke about your writing was so mature, was it very much indebted to Beethoven and the scores that you were studying, or were you already starting to take on your own voice at that point?
Oh gosh, that is a great question about one's own voice. I remember a different professor, once when I was 18, younger, starting at Manhattan School of Music, this professor had asked me, "Oh, what if I took this music you're writing?" I was writing a piece for saxophone quartet. He said, "What if I took this piece of music you're writing and played it on the organ? How would that make you feel?" And I looked at him funny. I said, that would be cool because you're playing my music. Awesome. And I just, he wanted to have this high level conversation about style and substance and one's own voice. And I had a really great time at Manhattan School of Music because 4 years later, at the very end, so flip side, I'm 21, 22, finishing my senior year, I'm taking a class with that professor. Very advanced 20th century music class where we're talking about everything from Schoenberg and Stravinsky to Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Lutoslawski, you know, like just insert names of Ligeti, a lot of Ligeti, I remember. And he started having a conversation with the class, and I was able to interject and have this conversation with him, an advanced conversation about theory and harmony and why Stravinsky was voicing a chord a certain way. So that's a long way of saying something very simple, which I think is voice to me is very much learned and slowly and developed slowly. And I know there's some composers who, from a very young age, immediately have a voice and a style. And I was not like that. And I feel like I'm still not like that. I feel like I'm still really developing my style and my voice. I feel that that's something that I'm going to work on for the rest of my life. And so I don't know. I guess the quick answer to that question, yeah, still developing my voice, working on it.
Well, that idea you mentioned there of some composers having access to it immediately is really fascinating in context of what you were saying there about having to learn voice. Is it something that's always within you and it's a case of learning the abilities to reach it?
Yes, I'd say, the older I get, the more I believe what you're saying, what you just said, which is that it's a matter of tuning out the noise and listening into what really is inside of you. And I know that sounds incredibly new agey and silly, but again, the more I work, the more projects I get to work on, the more I learn to trust my story and what I want to say, and the more confident I get with it, and the more in tune I get with being able to deliver something that I feel is truly me. And one of the things that works against us are these temp scores. And to be clear, I love temp music. Temp music can be incredible because you immediately understand what the director wants. At least good temp scores. You really get to know why the director is making the choices they are making cinematically and how you can support those choices. On the flip side, temp music can be a terrible, terrible thing because now you're locked in to a style and a substance and a tempo and a key and a feeling, that you didn't really, that isn't true to yourself. So that's yet another variable to being a film composer, that you need to learn to work with temp music in such a way that you understand how far you could push things in terms of one's own style and one's own voice. But then you also can learn, okay, I could push the harmonic style, I could push the melodic style, but the director needs this tempo. If it's not in this tempo, if it doesn't have this sort of ostinato rhythm, they're not going to like it. But everything else, I'm going to swap. But sometimes, they might say, oh, the pace is wrong, but we like everything else. Oh, so they like it. Maybe they like the harmony of this cue, but I could change the rhythmic feel of it. So that's how I'm going to get my style in here. So it's a bit of a challenge. Honestly, it's a mystery. Sometimes you're like a detective when you're working with temp music anyway, you're trying to decode what the filmmakers want, but then also, no one does a gig to not be able to write in their voice, so I'm always looking for ways to get my voice in there, even when the director says, I love this temp music.
So it's almost like you work out what's at the essence and what's making them choose the temp music, and then you try and filter that through your voice.
That's exactly right. That's a great way of putting it. And but at the same time, what is frustrating about that in some instances is part of that temp music still remains with you. You might say, oh, I really would have written this at a faster tempo or a slower tempo and let it grow, but the temp music was a certain way. So that's why on something like Shadow and Bone and some other projects I've worked on recently, I try to start as soon as possible. So Shadow and Bone, I started while they were still filming, and I wrote a ton of ideas and melodies and themes and textures and all sorts of ideas, so that by the time we got into the editorial, there was a bit of a library that we could draw upon that the producers had already given feedback on. So I understood how they regarded the music I had already written. And so that way, the shackles weren't so tight, so to speak. There's still a temp score, but there's always going to be temp scores to deal with. Very rarely do I get to work so early on a film. There is a film I'm working on that I haven't been able to talk about yet, that we started so early that it was no temp, and that is something that is really cool. When that can happen, when you can work without a temp and you really deliver the voice of a film from the beginning, zero temp. I've been able to do that a couple times before. For instance, Only the Brave was like that with Joe Kosinski. And there have been some other instances. Tron Legacy had no temp score. Tron Legacy, and obviously that was Daft Punk, but I was also highly involved in that. So I started very early on seeing the benefits of finding the voice of the score earlier than what is conventionally accepted.
With Only the Brave, that's one that really intrigues me. How did the destructive power of fire kind of influence your approach to that score? Because it's something that's so present in that movie throughout, and particularly on the occasions when you see it on screen, it's pretty breathtaking in a strange sort of way.
Well, one of the challenges was, what do these fires sound like? I don't think any of us want to find out what they sound like, right? But if you talk to these wildland firefighters, it's really amazing. They say, for those who have survived, these giant fires bearing down on them, they say it sounds like a locomotive, like a train bearing down on you. And so I knew very early on that it was going to be a big broadband sound. And a little side note here, one of the best parts of working with Joe Kosinski is he's always hiring the amazing sound teams at Skywalker Sound, who I've gotten to know personally now. And so we just start talking very early on. Like, hey, what type of sound are you thinking? They are hearing my music very early on. So there's this constant communication that we might not have on other projects where, you're just all kind of colliding at the end. But on Only the Brave, it was a case of, okay, I knew it was going to be this very broadband sound. So I need to find pockets where the music could live. And what I did very early on, before, again, while they were shooting the film, I recorded a lot of percussion so that when we get to the end of the film and this fire is bearing down on them, you have this percussive energy. And I thought that was a way for me to give a little bit of shape and rhythm to the locomotive bearing down on you. So you have this fire coming at you, but you also hear this percussive, and it's getting faster and faster and faster, as the scene goes on. So that was a really special film to me, because it took me a very long time to be able to watch and work on the end of that film without, having to step out of the room. It was a really, and I got to know Eric's widow, and I got to know, Brendan, and it really is wonderful when these films can become something more than just a job, that it becomes, I try to make every project I work on much more than a job, a dedication to story, but sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes it is just a job. But on Only the Brave, that certainly was not just a job. That was me really digging in and getting very, very emotionally attached to that. It was really meaningful. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think more people need to see that film.
Well, it's one that stays with you as well. Like that, the shot that I always come back to, it's when they're becoming surrounded by it. And it cuts to Josh Brolin, and you just see that look on his face where he knows.
Yep.
And it's just that one image that sticks in your mind.
It really is. I see it right now. Just you mentioning it, I see it, and it just, let's pray that none of us have to ever experience a feeling like that. But my hope with that score, and I know the hope with Joe, was giving the audience a little bit of that perspective, especially after growing so close to this team over that time, as well as then delivering. I think the most powerful, the two most powerful shots are the one you mentioned, and then there's the one afterwards where Brendan, played amazingly by Miles Teller, walks into the gym, and there's that really close up, rack shot where he walks into the frame and the camera focuses in on him. It's really, I get emotional just imagining it. So that was the reverse musically, that was a moment where you get to that shot and I get a little choked up just thinking about it. You get to that shot and the sound goes away. There's no sound. There's no talking. And you just hear a single guitar note, And so my goal with that score, at the end of the day, my goal with that score was I wanted it to feel like Brendan, the survivor, was telling you the story of his brothers in just an intimate setting. Like you were in his bedroom. Maybe he's playing guitar and he's just quietly telling you the story of his fallen brothers. And one of the things we did with that score was I'd set up the studio so that the guitarist was in the center, but I put the studio's most legendary, expensive microphone, like this Neumann M50. They're like $20,000 to get these microphones because the components, they're not even made anymore. You can't get them, but it's this amazing, revered microphone. I put it way far away in the corner, like 15, 20 feet away, and I turned up the gain and I had the guitarist play super quietly so that a lot of the sound you were hearing, it was as little of the direct sound of the guitar and as much of the sound of the air in the room as possible reacting to the guitar, if that makes sense, so that it really feels like you are in this intimate setting. Well, it wasn't a big studio. It was a small studio. And I'm really happy with how that came out. I think it's a really special score.
Where'd you get that idea from? How does an idea like that come to you to record it in that fashion?
Not my idea. A lot of idea. I get to be. That's one of the most amazing things about being a film composer, I think, is that we are not just composers. We get to be music producers. And I think that's a big difference between the current generation and, say, the John Williams generation. Now, of course, John Williams thinks like a producer sometimes. Oh, I want a vocal like this, or I want an instrument like this. But the interesting thing when you look back on John Williams's generation is the orchestra is almost this fixed setting where you know what you're going to get. You write for the orchestra. And again, I want to be clear. I'm overgeneralizing here. There are many ways to be very creative with producing an orchestra. But in general, it's like this fixed object. But film composers now, because everything is digital, everything's in the computer, and we can manipulate things digitally, you have all these different ways of working. So for instance, a great example on Shadow and Bone, when the Grisha are manipulating the small science or are using the small science, they're basically manipulating the elements. They're manipulating air, fire, water, that sort of thing. And so the way I wanted to convey that is whenever a Grisha is using their powers, I have taken some audio and reprocessed it. So for instance, in the second episode is the first time we get to see the Darkling perform the cut, which is this really awesome, like basically slice through the air that'll just slice anything in half. And so when the Darkling is approaching, you start hearing these French horns playing these weird textures because it's kind of this moment of tension where Alina's about to be killed, so the Darkling has to save her. So you hear these French horns playing these weird textures, but then as the Darkling forms the cut, it starts going, all of a sudden these horns start bending, and not just bending tone like by a note, by a step or two. They bend like several octaves down, something that just you can't do as a French horn on the French horn naturally. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of production. Like, you can do French horn bends naturally in the concert hall, but not in this way where, it's just bending 3 octaves down and you're compressing it and crushing it with a distortion pedal, So we get to have a lot of fun. It's also, it can be very intimidating, which is why I spend so much time focusing on story, because that story is what's going to help me, like what I was saying with Brendan and the guitar. That story that I'm going to tell helps me determine my musical choices, because there's nothing more intimidating than a blank page. A blank page with no, one of the things I love about film scoring is the answers are there. If I pay attention to the movie, if I pay attention to my filmmaker, if I pay attention to the story they're trying to tell, I start to get the kind of, like I was saying earlier, the detective thing. It's like, oh, so your story is about, a lone survivor. Okay. Oh, I wonder. The guitar, single notes. Oh, yeah, they're from Arizona where country music is popular. Okay, guitar. Yeah, guitar. And one of the things that Kaczynski told me, he said, their firehouse, and now we're talking about Only the Brave again, their firehouse is corrugated metal. It's just this weird corrugated metal. It's like not even a proper building, and you just walk up to it. It looks like a big shed. And so he said, what kind of metal instruments can we have? So while the guitar melodically is, this beautiful acoustic, a lot of the rhythmic guitars, a lot of the guitar textures are bowed and plucked dobros, which are and resonator guitars and basses, which are basically guitars that have these metal bodies that resonate very differently than a standard guitar body. So, one might say, Joe, why are you doing this? This sounds silly, like nobody's gonna ever be able to tell. But to me, that is exactly why I'm doing it. I'm building a score that is so intrinsically connected to the story that you can't separate it from. That score is only for Only the Brave. That is the only, and it's funny. Sometimes I wonder if my music gets temped less because of that, because I've crafted, because sometimes film composers, we get jobs because our music gets temped. So your music gets temped in something, they say, oh, we really like this music, hire that composer. But for me, my goal is to get hired way earlier than that. I want to be hired early on and be a real part of the storytelling.
What about something like Arctic then, because you came on really late in the day when it was pretty much finished being edited, right?
Correct. That's correct. But the same thing still applies, and that it's just a different challenge. So for instance, Arctic was temped with a lot of like new classical music, like, think of like Johann Johansson and Max Richter, but it was very acoustic where you hear the orchestra. And so, and for me, I'm going, this guy's lost in the Arctic. Where's the orchestra? I don't want to hear a straight orchestra. I want to hear the Arctic orchestra. I want to hear what the orchestra sounds like here. So I then took it as my job, knowing that, okay, the director really wants organic textures, right? The director really wants to feel strings and feel like the bows. So that's clear. I have to do that. But how am I going to make it Arctic? So what I did with that is I did two things. One is I altered the instrumentation. So rather than a straight string orchestra, I had a chorus of basses. I had 12 bass players. And I wrote for the full spectrum of the range of the basses. So when you think you're hearing like, a string orchestra, no, you're just hearing basses playing high and low, and it's like it becomes a choir. So when you hear that Arctic theme with the simple chords, that's a chorus of basses. But then the added layer to that is I recorded a lot at my studio, layers of basses, some cellos when I couldn't quite get the bass to sound exactly how I wanted it. But I would then re-record the instruments through resonating material. And when I say that, I had several. So I had a piece of wood where at one end I had a contact microphone. And what a contact microphone is, rather than picking up sound through air, it picks up sound through vibrations. So you attach it to something, and that's how it basically picks up the sound. And at the other end, I had a resonator speaker, and that is exactly the opposite. So it's a little speaker. If you played music through it and held it up to your ear, it would sound like a tinny, like you're listening through your little phone speaker that you normally put up to your ear. It sounds kind of like that. But then you attach, I had a suction cup, you attach it to the material, and all of a sudden it's causing that material to resonate. And so on one end, again, speaker, it's resonating this big piece of wood. On the other end, there's a microphone. There's this contact microphone. So I was in essence re-recording the basses, but through a piece of wood. I also had a piece of metal that I was using. And then I think most frequently I had used a big water jug, like you see when at the office water jugs. But I had put the resonating speaker on the outside, and rather than a contact mic, I stole a trick from my one of my engineers, Jeff Foster in the UK, who's amazing. He has these water jugs all over the studio when he's recording, and he just drops in like an SM57 or another simple mic into it, and it's suspended into the bottle. I did the same thing where I have the mic suspended in the bottle. And so again, I record these basses, play it back through these speakers, re-record it through these microphones, and all of a sudden it sounds like no orchestra you've ever heard before, because it's something I've created for Arctic, for this film. So it's a lot of fun, man. It's a little crazy sometimes, but it's a cool gig.
with that score as well, it almost feels like it's like stretching out over the horizon. Like it has that kind of sweeping quality to it.
It was to bring this, how do you bring to life something so lifeless? And that's something that the director and I spoke about a lot. When we see him grab the fish for the first time at the beginning of the movie, the director said to me, this is the first time he's felt something move. That's not him. He's been in this area for 6 months, alone. And this is the first time he feels something moving. And so you see him holding it. And that's the first time we hear score. Yeah, exactly. Isn't that great? I love that filmmaker. Joe did a great score recently, or did a great film recently, I should say, called Stowaway. That unfortunately it didn't work out that I could score it, but it's a great film nonetheless.
That just came out on Netflix, right?
It did. That same day as Shadow and Bone. Isn't that cool? We were texting each other that day. Yeah, we were texting each other that day. It was great because that weekend, the number one movie was Stowaway and the number one show was Shadow and Bone. That was really fantastic to see.
With what you were saying there as well about trying to make something so lifeless come alive, is that why there was so much music in the film as well? Because I think the runtime is like 138 and there's like 113 music in it, which is a huge amount for a film, yeah.
I think I'm known for these long scores. The films I get hired for, they generally need a lot of music. Sometimes I wish I could be on films where, we just need 20 minutes of music here and there. It's all songs, I think originally there was more music than that in Arctic, and I really pushed Joe to use less music. And I think it was just when you have a film like that is almost done and temped before you're involved, that's something I really focus on, is trying to just be a fresh voice for the filmmaker. For instance, this filmmaker, on any movie I try to do this, but on something especially where I get brought in later like that, the filmmaker has been singing this with this movie for 6 months. Who knows how long? Sometimes 6 years in terms of, they started writing the script 6 years ago, or they started the pitch 6 years ago or something like that. And now they're finally making the movie. So their perspective might be skewed. So when I get brought in, I try to be a fresh voice. So one of the things I brought to the table, there was originally score. There's this moment where there's a storm blowing and there's this excitement and tension. And then suddenly, this big moment happens that is like a breathtaking moment. And it used to be that the music played through that. And I said, no. At that moment, let's cut out the music. And you know what? Let's do what they did in The Godfather, where we just cut out the storm too. So there's a great moment in The Godfather where, this train is approaching because they're eating at a restaurant right underneath the train tracks. And you hear this train bearing down. It's getting closer and closer and closer. But they're using that sound. Coppola is using that sound to build tension. There's no score. So building tension. And right when the train can't get any louder, Al Pacino's character gets up and shoots the two people he's having dinner with. And after that moment, after the gunshots, the train's gone. There's no train. And of course, in the real world, where did the train go? The train doesn't just disappear. But in the filmmaking world, the train disappeared. And then that's where the score comes in after that. And so it's one of my favorite moments to show how sound and visuals, you could break all these rules and do all this crazy stuff. But the emotion and the power of that moment is built by the way the sound and music interact with the tension of the scene.
It's so rare that we hear silence. I mean, particularly in modern movies today as well. Just silence on its own. It's a very, I don't know why it is we've kind of shied away from it. I guess with this kind of idea of us constantly needing to be stimulated, it's not as prevalent as it would have been when The Godfather was kind of taking place.
I've gotten up and walked out of theaters because there was a movie several years ago that it wasn't that the movie was bad. It was just that it was just nonstop music, nonstop sound, nonstop everything. And I just couldn't take it anymore. I think you're setting people up to fall asleep and lose attention too, which is weird. You think, I need to keep everyone's attention, so pulse pounding music all the time. Well, I mean, if your baseline is pulse pounding music, then that is your baseline. You need silence to help make the music more intense. So that was something we worked very hard on. I guess there is a lot of music in Arctic, but to me, I feel like we've fought really hard. We worked really hard. Everyone involved, Joe and the director and Ryan, the editor, we worked really hard to find moments where we could have silence so that the music we do have is as powerful as it could be.
It's funny, I was chuckling there when you mentioned this idea of you're almost setting up the audience to fall asleep because it's just so constant. I remember a few years back going to see John Wick 2 with a couple of friends, and for some reason as well in the cinema they'd turned the volume up so loud and it was just pounding you the whole time. And I looked over about halfway through the movie and one of the guys sitting to the right of me was out stone cold, head back, snoring.
Exactly, that's exactly right. To me, it's a very primetime network TV thing to just have constant stuff because they're trying to hold your attention. Oh, like where it's housewives are cooking and cleaning and we need to hold everyone's attention. To me, like, that is not my baseline. My baseline is, hey, we're creating a cinematic experience. How do we take people? It's the roller coaster. Oh my God, we're going up, 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 up. Oh, we're going down, down. Oh, there's a curve. Like that to me. Very rarely does a roller coaster, you get in the roller coaster and it just starts with a downhill, right? The roller coaster starts with you going up, 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 ratcheting the tension. So yeah, if you just start with that downhill thrill, then that's your baseline, and that, to me, that's not very effective.
No, you're setting yourself up for a fall.
Exactly.
It's interesting because we've spoken quite a bit about these kind of crazy recording techniques that you'll use in the way that you'll come up with ideas that are kind of perfectly suited to the film. When you're in the process of composing the score, does it feel like a series of mini victories? Is every time you do that, are you getting a sense of accomplishment and you're one step closer? Or do you only really get that sense of satisfaction once it's fully complete?
I get that sense of satisfaction when the check arrives. No, that's a terrible joke. That is not where I get my sense of satisfaction. The crazy thing about what we do is it can be very political. It can be very hectic. That it's really not until I'm sitting in the theater, looking at the film, that's when I start to feel, oh, I guess I did something, because it is so constant. And I think the mark of any good artist is that whatever we're working on right now is shit, like, oh, this is terrible. What can I do to make it better? I'm always trying to make it better and better and better. And usually when you cut to the theater and I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh, I guess that's not that bad. I'll never do that. That was a terrible idea. Let me do it. I'll do it better next time, So I try not to rest on any laurels. I love doing these interviews because it kind of gives me a chance to reflect on some cool things I've done. But if you gave me Arctic tomorrow to rescore, I'd score it completely differently because I'm at a different place in my life. I'm thinking about music differently. I have new ideas, new things I want to try, and I think that is the mark of a good artist. He is someone who is trying to raise the bar and explore things. And even like what I was saying earlier, that's something I'm a little jealous about of someone like John Williams. Obviously, we're all jealous of John Williams, but John Williams has that orchestra. And so because you have these limitations, he could explore really creatively within those boundaries. There's so much nuance going on in every orchestral cue that he's exploring something new. There's so many ways to explore. Whereas modern production, with all the toys we have and all the plugins, you could sometimes get really lost in trying stuff and just trying wacky stuff because there aren't as many limitations. So I think it is really important to put limitations on yourself when you work. And for me, that's why I talk so passionately about stories, because I'm using that story to define those limitations that I'm putting on myself as I work, limiting the instrumentation, limiting the types of plugins I'm using, limiting the types of instruments I could use. Is really important that I do that, because otherwise I could just get lost and just never complete a single cue.
What were some of the limitations you set down for yourself on Straight Outta Compton?
So on that one, I wanted the theme to be super simple, triadic, especially because I want to hearken gospel music. I make no claims to be an expert in gospel, but I wanted to feel this sense of home, something sacred, something familiar. So that main theme, simple triads, moving in a very familiar way, a couple of unexpected twists and turns, but that was so important because I wanted the audience to connect with these characters on an emotional level. And that is, I should say not emotional level, on a visceral level at their weakest moments, at their most human moments. Because their music, the music of these characters, Dre, Cube, is really great at connecting you to these characters when they're at their most powerful, when they are confident and doing something really cool. There's a lot of bravado and excitement. That is wonderful. That's what's awesome about their music. But what their music doesn't get to is their vulnerability, their insecurities, their weakest moments. And that's something where I felt it was really important to develop a sound and feel. So I spent a lot of time there. The other part is just the action music of that film. And my goodness, that film is now going on 6 years old, and I feel like I was just a baby when I was doing that. I feel like I do things even differently now. But what I remember doing for the action music of Straight Outta Compton was I tried to take the film tropes that we have for action music, which is, big drums, taikos, pulsating synths, but I tried to use them like Dre might have used them with, like, as a sampler. So I wasn't trying to program them like one would maybe program a traditional film score. I was trying to program them like one would program a drum machine or a sampler. So that was the fun I had. I also want to use 8 bass flutes. And since I had a bit of a budget, I just hired 8 bass flutes and just had them double all the melodies and do all these cool textures. And that was fun. It's you don't hear it too much in the score, but it provided this really cool organic humanity from time to time. As you could tell, if you give me a little bit of budget, I'll try something new. I'll try something you've never heard before, and hopefully it'll be really cool.
With what you were talking about there in regards to the action scenes, did you learn anything from that you then carried into Stuber?
Yes, I did. Stuber, what was so much fun about that was I got to really play into my synths. I really got to play into all sorts of other textures and plugins that I hadn't used in a while, and analog synths I hadn't used in a while, since Michael Dallas was going for this 1980s Beverly Hills Cop, buddy cop vibe. I got to do some really, really, really cool stuff that I hadn't done in quite some time.
What surprised you most when you were working on that?
Surprised me how rusty I was at doing those type of driving electronic scores. I hadn't done one in a while. I had just come off of, was it Greatest Showman and Arctic, where I was using a lot of organic instrumentation, and I was still using plenty of synths on those scores, to be sure, but I wasn't doing that Tangerine Dream, Georgia Moroder, pulsy synth thing that I've done before, but I had to kind of reinvent that side of me. And I think that's yet another reason why I love what we do and what I get to do as a film composer is I have this really broad set of skills that I can sharpen different knives in the toolbox every once in a while and try something different. I think I'd be terribly bored if I just scored the same TV show every day and that's all I did or something, which is why I try to keep things interesting, why I try to vary it up. I'll do TV. I'm doing a VR project right now, so I get to I'm learning how spatial audio works. So it's really important for me to do that. And I'll tell you why I try to do that, so that whenever a filmmaker comes to me with a story to tell, that I can help them tell that story exactly how they're hoping to tell it, because of this broad set of skills I've developed, that their unique story, I really can tell it the right way and in a unique way. That's why I keep these different knives sharp, so that I could be a really essential and valuable part of the filmmaking process.
I was listening back to the last conversation we did a few weeks ago today, and we rounded up by talking about Stuber.
Yes, we started. We should probably restart that one and just get into it.
It was interesting because just before we got onto it, you spoke about, we were like kind of talking about where you get the sense of accomplishment from when you're working on a score. And you said it was when you're seated in the theater, you're watching the movie, the lights go down, and you see it for the first time with an audience. Do you remember what that experience was like with Stuber?
I did. I do remember that experience. You know, what was so fun about Stuber, it was yet another specific type of movie that I had never done before. And I feel so fortunate that filmmakers trust me to do a diverse set of projects. You know, I had never done like a buddy cop drama, or excuse me, not a drama, a buddy cop comedy, but that has obviously some, I mean, one of the reasons that I was hired is it does have some drama too, with action, with intense action. I think, Mike Dowse, the filmmaker, liked the Raid films, but he also heard what I could do with electronics. So, we spoke a lot about 80s buddy cop movies like Beverly Hills Cop and Midnight Run and that sort of thing, and about how that can influence the score. But yeah, what's so great about the lights going down in a theater and on a comedy film is you have an interaction with the audience unlike any other film. Sure, like in an action adventure, you might have cheering, and that's great. That's always great when you break that seal, because it's very hard to get an audience to engage with a film like that. But in comedy, it's known that you're gonna get the reaction from the audience. So the first time I was in a theater seeing that film was actually, it was almost done, but it wasn't quite done. We took a work in progress. It was like 95% done, but we took a work in progress to South by Southwest in March. I guess that was March 2019. My goodness.
Wow.
Time flies, I guess. But that, and the great thing about South by Southwest is everyone's already having a great time. They're there to enjoy themselves at a film festival, see a lot of live music, obviously a lot of bars, a lot of great places to eat in Texas, a lot of great barbecue. So people are already in a great mood. So it's just awesome as a composer to see. I think it's also it's a great reminder for us that we are just one tool in this vast set of a toolkit that you need to make a film work. And in fact, we are very important. I oftentimes say music is the most important part of a film in some ways. It really is. It drives the emotion and the intensity. So yes, that is a long answer to your very simple question.
Are you nervous when the lights go down for that first time?
It depends on the situation. If the film is finished, it's actually like a bit of a relaxing moment. I've finished the film. I've actually finished the film. Nobody's going to pull me or call me and say, Joe, we rewrote the ending. Please, rewrite the music, which happens more than you think. So in some ways it's very cathartic. It's very relaxing. It's very, it's like a notch in the belt, like, oh, another one I did, I'm sharing with the world, and I think that's what it comes down to with me, and not to sound insane or anything, but there is just this really cool feeling I get from sharing, that I've shared this thing that I've helped make with the world, if that makes any sense. I think it's where I really take pride in the fact that something I'm doing is contributing to the planet, because it's very, day to day, 99% of the time I'm sitting in my studio working and the lights are down and I'm, you're wondering what the heck am I actually doing here? And then, it's nice that 1 out of 100 days or so you get to do a little you get to go to a screening or go to something where it says, oh, I'm actually bringing joy to people. I'm actually part of something that is making the world better. And that is great. So, especially over this past year where there have been so many people on the front lines dealing with something so traumatic, and I get to sit at home and feel lucky and just kind of, play with some keyboards and deliver some music. How lucky is that? But it is important to remember sometimes, hey, I'm bringing joy to people, and that is really, really important.
That joy that you get from sharing in that moment, how does that compare to when you share the music with, say the director for the first time? Is there a similar parallel there? Does that feeling crop up again? No.
No, it's horrifying. I really do. I've said this before, that first time playing music for someone, it's like being naked. It's like, hey, this is my art. This is who I am. What do you think? And it can be traumatic, and that's why it's really important. I think one of the most important things or at least that I've chosen to make important, is to try to choose who I want to work with. Meaning, I've tried to set up my career where the older I get, the more credits I have, the more choosy I become, and the more limited I am in terms of welcoming people into the studio. And maybe that's sounding over dramatic, because there's definitely times where I really want a project, I'm chasing after something. So don't get me wrong, I'm still out there chasing down projects, trying to meet new people, trying to do new things. But at the same time, we are so vulnerable that when we attach ourselves to something and choose to work on something, that a little bit of us becomes a part of that. A friend of mine used to say that he had a professor that said, you have to be really careful who you date, because they become part of you, and they become more like you, and you become more like them, and you become a part of them, and they become a part of you. And that might sound silly, but I treat projects and collaborators the same way. That I try to be. Again, I've certainly made my fair share of mistakes and worked on my fair share of crappy projects, but regardless, I'm trying to always keep the bar really high and work with great people, for that very reason, that we are so vulnerable. We're naked, and we are just, we get absorbed into this machine that, I like to think of, between Mike Dowse, who I just spoke about, Peter Atencio, Joe Kaczynski, Gareth Evans, like the people I've worked with, I've been so fortunate, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some here, like Eric Heisler on Shadow and Bone. There are just so many wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people I've been able to work with, and I always try to keep working with them, because I feel so lucky to have that relationship and have that really rewarding creative spirit with them.
I think what you're saying as well there, it comes down to, it's an emotional sacrifice, isn't it? And you want to make sure that it's going to feel worthwhile, and you're not going to be putting yourself out there unnecessarily.
Yeah, you do. And especially if you don't do things halfway, I think there are a lot of film composers out there who are incredibly talented at delivering vast quantities of music very quickly for any project, and can do 12 movies a year or something. There are,
they want that third house.
Phenomenally talented. Yeah, exactly. They want that third house. They want that, and for me, and I'm not saying I'm any better or worse than those composers. It's a different thing that drives me. I think, for me, I'm chasing after something that is infinite, this art, and look, I know how silly I am saying that, in that, film music, you're delivering a service, and, like a lot of artsy folks will look down at film music because of that. But at the same time, I think of film music and film as its own art, and that I love to be a part of, and I respect it greatly. So I'm trying to deliver something infinite. I'm trying to deliver something that can't be cheapened to, hey, I spent 2 weeks on this film, and then I spend 2 weeks on another film, and I get a big check, and then I buy that third house. Exactly. I'm trying to chase after something different, but it would be nice to have that third house. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing it all wrong. Heck, it would be nice to have that second house at this point. So look, I think there's a great, if you look at at our industry out there, there are a lot of really unhappy rich people. So I think it's really important to remind yourself that, if the only thing driving you is money, the arts is probably a really bad place to try to do that.
Did you come to that revelation quite early on, that you needed something more from it, and this wasn't just going to be a service for you, providing a service for you?
No, I'm really fortunate that I had some great mentors. I think the most important in that regard being Daft Punk, and if anyone who knows Daft Punk's career and knows about them, they know that they're very mysterious, they're very picky, and they told me, Joe, what defines your career is not what you say yes to. What is going to define your career is what you say no to. And I think that really hit me really hard. Yeah. And there's other people, as well, who have kind of shared that spirit with me. I feel very fortunate that, look, I'll just come out and say it. I did not spend a lot of time at remote control. I knew some composers down there. I knew some people down there. But, that is a very, and what's so weird about that place is there are some amazing composers down there who deliver amazing infinite music. Hans obviously being the head of it. He has delivered the scores where he really pours himself into is some of the finest work.
What is remote control? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. That's Hans Zimmer's studio. That's his multitude of buildings and composers and whatnot. And I think, again, to be very, very clear, Hans and a lot of the people down there deliver some of the best art being created today. At the same time, they've been able to build this branding that delivers vast quantities of music. And, if you just go to them and say, here's $1 million, I need you to score my movie, you might get, just the supermarket version of Inception, which to me is a great tragedy, so it's interesting. I luckily was not very much exposed to that mindset. I do wonder if they're in a different timeline, had I been mentored that way, that maybe my belief set would be different, that I would say, hey, this is what I believe, 9 out of 10 films that you do are going to be bad. So why think about them? Just deliver the same thing you've been delivering, just output the same thing, just change a few notes, just deliver the same cues again and then move on with your life. At the same time, I feel very strongly that when a filmmaker comes to me and they ask me to be a part of their work, that they're inviting me as an artist to truly represent their film and to truly deliver something special and to become vulnerable and to really deliver that. So and again, that's why I try to be a little bit picky, because that is what I'm going to do regardless. I'm going to get naked and get in bed with your film and do something really special for it. And so there are times where I say no, because I realize they just want me to deliver, they want me to deliver Tron, or they want me to deliver The Raid, or deliver something else I've worked on, and that is something I try to avoid. So anyway, I'm probably getting too much into the weeds, and people are going to yell at me and get mad at me because I'm saying stupid stuff. But it's interesting. I think all we have at the end of the day is this magical art. I don't think when I die, there are going to be people who point to the special art that I created, not the fact that I did 5,000 movies. They're gonna, hopefully I'm remembered for that handful of scores where I was able to really, and those handful of projects where I was able to really deliver something super special. And that's because whenever I approach a project, I try to deliver that, So anyway, now I'm getting sentimental.
What scores that you've worked on so far do you feel fit into that group of special experiences for you?
Oh, it's hard. It's hard for me. It's like asking someone with 10 kids, who's their favorite, because for instance, there are projects I've worked on where I'm super proud of the music, but, nobody really, the film wasn't seen that much. Like, for instance, there's a great little film I did with a really great writer, director named Orr Nuziel. It's called Shimmer Lake. It's on Netflix. It's a Netflix film. And I think it's a really cool score, and it's a really cool film. So, that I'm not saying that's my favorite project I've ever done, but it is a really cool score that I'm really proud of, and I'm really proud of that film and how it turned out. So, there are all sorts of those. I think that's the unfortunate reality of our world, is that, you pour your heart and soul into something, but you don't really have control over what happens to it. So that was a cool indie film that we sold to Netflix. And when I use the word we very generously, I was not involved in selling it to Netflix. I'm just the composer. The producers sold it to Netflix. And that's it. The soundtrack, I was able to work out a soundtrack thing with Varese. The soundtrack came out on Varese, and so that's out there. But, there's a handful of projects like that. I think it's really rare when you have something like Shadow and Bone, where Shadow and Bone I poured my heart and soul into, and I said, I have a feeling this is going to be super cool. I'm going to go not only do my usual, just getting naked, but I'm really going to go that extra mile and craft something really special and thematic and bold. And I knew that the showrunner was game for that. And the producers came to me knowing that I could deliver something like that. It was a very specific, we want you to score this thing. We think you're going to do a great job. And so I said, great. You came to me because of my taste and my talents and the way I think about things. So I'm really going to do something special. And it's very rare. Again, it's very rare when something actually hits the zeitgeist and people are into it and people see it, and a lot of people become fans of it, and there's award season talk and whatnot. So it's really special when that happens. It's not what drives me. I'm not driven by, this show might be a big hit and might get some awards. If that's what drove me, my goodness, maybe I'd become one of those guys who scores 10 movies a year or something. It sure is nice when that happens, I guess.
Does your approach differ in any way when you know something is going to hit the zeitgeist? Because Tron Legacy, for example, or Oblivion, when you've got Tom Cruise at the center of that, these films are going to have an impact as you're working on them, I imagine.
It's impossible for me, I think it would be silly for me to say, oh, no, I approach everything the same. Yes, of course, you try to give your heart and soul to everything you work on. That's why I say yes. At the same time, obviously, if Tom Cruise is in the room, that's something very different. And so there's a whole different energy there. So you're right in that, in that sometimes these projects, there is a vibe about them or something about them where it's going to be different. That being said, that's what I use to try to determine if I say yes to a project is, am I going to be able to commit myself to this? Am I going to want to give myself 100% over to this project? And if the answer is yes, then I try to find a way to do the project. And if the answer is no, I try to think if it's really worth me doing the project, of other ways, that is one of the interesting things about Hollywood, right? Is sometimes you say, okay, I'm going to do this project because it's a favor to this executive or this studio or this filmmaker that I really want to work with. Maybe I'm not vibing with this specific project, but I want to do it to work with this person, or to work with this group of people, or, I try not to make it about money. I try to make it about that relationship and that, wanting to grow the artistic relationship. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview with Steven Soderbergh today, who kind of said something similar, where when he reads a script or he gets offered something, there are only two answers. It's either no or hell yes.
Oh, that's great. And that's exactly the best thing is when and I went through this recently. I read a script and it was a hell yes. And I made a great pitch to the filmmaker, and the filmmaker loved my pitch, and then I didn't get hired. And that is unfortunately reality of what we do, is that, you try to chase after something with hell yes, and they might say hell no to you, but that's okay. There's a certain amount of pleasure I take by reading the script and coming up with an idea that fuels me. That is part of the job.
We've mentioned Gareth Evans a couple of times as well too with the Raid movies. And the thing that always strikes me about them is that the sound design is such an integral part of the action and the tension. It's so well done and to such a high standard. How does that impact you as a composer? How do you feed off the sound design? Does that impact your approach in any way?
I have to say what's so awesome about Gareth is he has his core team with him. And I'm bummed I haven't scored his last couple of projects, but it's been his core team of two composers, Ogi and Fajar from Indonesia, who have become friends of mine because we did one of the Raid movies together, and I saw how they work. And they not only write the score, but they also do the sound design. And they have continued working with Gareth. And what's so great about that, and regardless of whether it's obviously I don't do sound design, so I don't think you need to be a composer / sound designer, but the reality is that there is a relationship between music and sound that, if done well, there is a certain amount of, things just lock together, which is why when I work certain projects I work on, I try to really get a relationship going with the sound designer and sound team, and to inform them of why I'm making the decisions that I'm making, of what my take is on the score and what types of sounds and tools I'll be using, whether it's orchestral or mostly orchestral or mostly electronic or a combination of the two, and what types of electronic sounds, what keys. I might even try to send them some ideas, some music I'm working on, because you're exactly right. The relationship between score and sound is perhaps one of the most important relationships in the film, because there's one visual track and there's one soundtrack. At the end of the day, all the sound elements get married together, and if you don't know how to collaborate with the sound team, then there are going to be issues, and there are going to be times where you're going to be disappointed. I've spent a lot of my life I'm serious. I've spent a lot of my life getting to know sound designers, going to dubs. And again, I think I've probably said this before. I hate going to dubs because they're dark rooms. It's, 90 decibels. It's so loud, all day. Just listen. I put in earplugs sometimes because it's just so unbearable. Sometimes you're just mixing the same scene over and over. But I spent a lot of time seeing how the mixers and sound designers work, because that's it for most of the people. Most of the people who experience my work, they're not buying the soundtrack. They're experiencing my work as one unit with the film, with the TV show, with that experience. So it is my job, if I want my work to deliver at its finest, at its best, if I want to be the best film composer around, that means that I really need to truly understand how that final soundtrack for the film is made. And so when I write, I keep the dialogue on most of the time. I keep the temp effects on most of the time, so that I could hear what the goals are, what the filmmaker's goals are, so that I'm crafting the score. Someone once said, film music is like opera without the voice, and the voice is that soundtrack. The sound design is part of your music. So ultimately, if I'm going to deliver something incredible as a cinematic experience, I need to be aware of the people who are working with me on that final sound print, and that includes the sound designers, the dialogue editors. So, my entire studio, for instance, the speakers I use are JBL speakers, which some composers might look at and be like, oh, those aren't as expensive as my super fancy ATC or PMC custom designed $100,000 setup, And it's like, well, nobody has those speakers, and in every theater in the world, there's either JBLs or Meyers. My room sounds just like a theater, so that when I go to a dub stage, I hear exactly what I intended. That's how I mix. All my mixes come out of my room, and when I go to the dub stage, I hear exactly what I was intending to hear. And it's taken me a long time. I've had this goal for 10 years, so it's taken me a long time to figure that out. And I think more composers would be better served with that as the goal, rather than just kind of buying whatever fancy stuff is hot right now, but that's me personally. And there are a lot of great engineers and mixers who work on very fancy, expensive speakers. So great.
Does that change again though when you're working on something like a VR game and you're kind of dealing with spatial sound?
Well, I have a headphone I'm looking at right in the corner over there that so two things. I have a set of headphones where I've attached a Bluetooth head tracker, so that it works, coincides with a plugin I could put in Pro Tools that allows me to basically, put on these headphones and move my head around and hear sound in a 3D environment. That is very basic. It's not as awesome as I'd hope, but it gets the job done. Literally this week, my main mix room is down for the week because we are installing Dolby Atmos, and I'll be the first to say some things about Dolby Atmos are a bit of a gimmick, but the things that aren't a gimmick about Dolby Atmos is the spatialization technology and the way it scales up and scales down. That's really exciting, that if you are tuned properly to a certain Dolby spec, that you can take your music into the VR world, into a theater, or to an iPad, and you're going to hear a certain, it's going to translate in a certain way. So that's very exciting for me to now within my studio be able to access that. And you're exactly right. I'm actually, last year was the first time I worked on a VR project. We are working on further installments of that VR project. And so I'm trying to learn. Actually, that's a lie. A couple years ago, I worked on a different VR project that was more of a short film, less interactive than what I'm working on now. And it's a film called Myth. I'm really proud of it, actually. It was with Disney Animation. Really proud of that score. Had a great time doing it. And that felt like my primer into VR. And it feels like now that I'm doing this truly VR, people can get their Oculus and experience this thing, and it's a Star Wars thing, so they get to hold a lightsaber in VR. That is really cool. Now I feel like I'm really in it, so I'm trying to learn, and everyone's involved is teaching me all about it. So I'm trying to get better and better at it, because again, it's I'm trying to understand how my music is consumed and used and become better at making a better product, if that makes any sense. It sounds, we start with, a few minutes ago we were talking about art and creativity, and now I'm talking about like it's a product, but you need a bit of both in order to be successful in this world, I think.
I think as well with what you were saying there, that a Star Wars game would probably be a good first foray into that VR world, would it? Because you have a slight familiarity with a lot of the sounds.
That is a good point. The other thing too is, how are we going to go back to Star Wars as a film once you can truly be a Jedi? I think we're still in its infancy. There are a couple of episodes of the game that I'm working on, and if you look at the first one, that one you get to be a Jedi. You're training to be a Jedi. How awesome is that? And it feels like it's still very much in its infancy. Maybe 10 years from now, maybe a year from now or 5 years from now, but I feel like 10 years from now, the experientialness of it, it's going to be hard to go to a theater and watch a Star Wars film when you can sit at home and truly become a Jedi. And maybe I'm overblowing this, but it is interesting, isn't it?
Does it feel more like a new art form to you, do you think, as opposed to a continuation of cinema?
Yes and no. Yes, in a way that it is something completely new. At the same time, it is a game. But what are games? Games are storytelling that you get to choose your own adventure and test your skills. So, look, to me, everything is related to wall paintings and telling stories around a fire, in a cave 10,000 BC. I think everything is everything at the end of the day is storytelling, and that is something else that I find very important to what I do. Whenever I sit down and I'm trying to score something, I go, what are we actually trying to say here? What is being communicated in this scene that is furthering the story, and how am I trying to tell it? And that is something that carries over, whether it's a short film or a Marvel movie or a Star Wars film or a incidental music for a play, which I love doing when I can, or a podcast. That carries over to everything. There's something, if you as a composer can help someone tell a story, you can essentially do anything. And then all this stuff we've been talking about, like sound design and speakers and whatnot, that's just extensions of the story. That's just allowing me to be a better storyteller. At the end of the day, we're just storytellers, when you bring us down to our most simplest.
It feels crazy as well. I mean, I remember reading like Choose Your Own Adventure books as a kid, and now it feels like we're at the point where it's almost like you're in the book itself, with this whole kind of new frontier of VR and where we're going to go with that next.
Absolutely. There's always going to be a place for cinema. You don't want to just pick up a lightsaber and, spend a bunch of calories in the sometimes you just want to sit down and let a film wash over you. So I'm very much someone who thinks that cinema, big dark space, cinema will be around as long as humans are in existence. Will it be the same as it was in the year 2018 or 2011? Obviously, no, but it will be part of what we do, and so it's important for me to. Yeah, sometimes I've spent a lot of time gearing myself to deliver for music for a dark theater and really sound cinematic and sound great on big speakers in a dark room. And everything I've done for the past 2 years has been streaming. So, sometimes it's a little depressing, but at the same time, what are we doing? We're telling stories. And that is something that is, if you can tell a story, that is something that is future proof, because as long as humans are alive, we have the need to share and tell stories.